Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those joining us this afternoon who have not been at this morning's session or the earlier session, I'm Virginia Birrell, the CEO of the Australia-China Business Council in Victoria and the newly appointed National Executive Officer for ACBC nationally. I'm absolutely delighted to have you joining us for this session. This is what we are calling phase 2 of a very insightful day, and we had our terrific plenary and session 1 earlier. And if you missed any part of that, the recordings will be available at a later date and sent to you. I'd now like to introduce the second session of the day, a curated group of business and medical leaders heavily involved in the China market. Who better to learn from than those who have gone before? These people have used a variety of strategies and found success in the complex and huge China market. Associate Professor David Anderson is the Deputy Director of the Burnet Institute, an Australian medical research institute that combines research in the laboratory and the field with public health action to address major health issues affecting disadvantaged communities in Australia and internationally. A leader in designing better diagnostics, vaccines, antiviral therapies for the control of major viral infections in humans, Davis had published more than 60 original research papers and invited chapters. He has presented an original research work at numerous national and international scientific meetings, and we welcome him today very warmly to deliver his keynote presentation, A Decade of Engagement with China, the Good, the Bad, and the Insights. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Virginia. Let me just see if I can get my slides up properly. Is that showing in full screen?
Not to me, no. Zach, are we able to help there with help David?
Let me just try again. You'd think I'd have enough practice with this, but here we are. That should work.
All have different skill sets we've discovered. There we go. That's looking better. Thank you. Thank you.
Press the buttons in the correct order makes a difference. I kept forgetting that. Thanks very much, Virginia, and the rest of the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would at the outset also like to thank my colleague, Fan Lee, who was going to speak on our behalf when I was meant to be hiking in the Flinders Ranges this week. But like most of people's plans this year, that didn't quite come to fruition. And it is my pleasure to speak to you on what for me is, a decade of engagement with China in the biotech space, but really building on more than 30 years of experience of working both with China and with visiting colleagues from China, all the way back to our very early days at Fairfield Hospital. And as Virginia mentioned, my day job, let's say, is as Deputy Director of the Burnet Institute and also Chief Scientific Officer of the Burnet Diagnostics Initiative, a new initiative this year that I'll describe a little bit later on, and serving as CEO of Nanjing Biopoint Diagnostics, the Burnet's majority-owned spin-off company in Nanjing. And at the outset, I just want to tell you a little bit more background on the Burnet, which Virginia touched on. But the photo on the right here really tells you what the Burnet is about and what the research I've focused on for the past 15 years or so is particularly about, which is developing diagnostic tests for unmet medical needs that can reach the poorest and most marginalised populations in the world. In this case, our hepatitis E virus diagnostic test being used in a refugee camp in Chad about 15 years ago. So the Burnet is a not-for-profit independent medical research institute. Amanda Caples talked earlier about how strong Victoria is in the medical health and medical research sector, and the Burnet is a proud member of that community. But the Burnet is quite unique in having a focus not only on health and medical research in the laboratory, like most research institutes, but also very practical public health action, as well as a very strong international focus for that public health action and international development. And as part of that, we're the only medical research institute that is also accredited by DFAT as a development non-government organisation, and that influences a lot of the scope of the work that we do. Our headquarters, of course, are in Melbourne, where we're co-located with the Alfred Hospital, which is one of the largest teaching hospitals in Australia, for those of you not based here in Melbourne. But as many of you will know, and with major support from the Victorian state government, the Burnet will be relocating to the Parkville precinct in roughly 5 years as a founding member of the Australian Institutes for Infectious Diseases, which is really going to give much greater impetus to the work that we can do. Burnet has around 400 staff located regionally and internationally, with offices in the Asia Pacific region. We have quite a large number of staff in Myanmar, who are obviously doing it tough at the moment, and our thoughts always go out to them, as well as many staff in Papua New Guinea. And we have a very long engagement with China, going back really to the early 90s in public health working very closely with the Ministry of Health in China, but more recently with the work that we've done through establishing Nanjing Biopoint and working particularly with the Jiangsu provincial government and Nanjing in particular in the biotech space. And the Burnet is very much driven by its purpose. Every medical research institute has a vision statement or a mission statement, but the Burnet really does try to live by its purpose statement, which is currently being reviewed slightly, but the sentiment is the same, which is to achieve better health for vulnerable communities in Australia and internationally by accelerating the translation of research, discovery and evidence into sustainable health solutions. And I read that out in full because it really tells you why we set up a company in China, because we were very good at doing research and discovery and generating evidence. But as I'll explain in more detail in a moment, the translation of that into actual outcomes for patients was very slow, and we needed to find a way to accelerate that. And because of all the different skills we have, we felt that we had a real opportunity to use China as a way to accelerate the translation and industrialization of the research to fulfill that purpose. Now, before China, we had developed a couple of point-of-care diagnostic tests. These, you can't tell the scale on the screen, but they're essentially the size of a pregnancy test, but both of them using a drop of blood. The one that I showed you on the first slide being used in a refugee camp in Chad is for a waterborne form of viral hepatitis called hepatitis E that was licensed quite a number of years ago, 2005, to a company in Singapore. The Visitec CD4 test, which measures CD4 T cells in HIV/AIDS, was licensed to Omega Diagnostics in the UK in 2012. But the issue that we were facing was that it took 8 years to complete a licensing deal for the hepatitis E test and more than 4 years to complete a licensing deal for the CD4 test, even though the CD4 test in particular was considered a very high priority by the WHO. But it was just really hard for us to find a partner with the right idea and the right commitment to take our innovation forward. And now, 15 years after we started that project, our CD4 test is the only point-of-care CD4 test on the market in the world, and we expect it's going to have a big impact. But we wish that could have happened much faster. And this was a major impetus behind us deciding to set up our own company in China so that we could try and bridge that first valley of death in the commercialization and industrialization process. And anticipating a question that might come up of why Nanjing, well, together with our Managing Director Feng Yi and a whole group of other Chinese Australian partners, I believe Yu Xiong is on the call today. He was one of the people involved. We looked at many, many different sites around China, and we often used to joke that if you threw a rock in the air in China, it would probably land in a biotech park. So it was very hard to decide where to go. But in the end, Nanjing seemed very attractive because I hope no one will mind if I call it a second-tier city with a first-tier university sector and a very strong commitment to research and innovation and education. And of course, having the sister state, the very long-standing sister state relationship with Victoria and Jiangsu province is very important and has proven to be very important for us during our time there. And in the end, we were able to attract a small but significant grant from the Nanjing government. $1 million RMB is really very little cash, but it did come with free rent, for example, for our laboratory facilities for 5 years and many other benefits. And with that, and with a lot of backing from the Burnet Institute, and I really want to pay tribute here to my colleagues back setting up the company, Lisa Renkin, who I think has also joined us today, and Jeff Drinkhahn and Ben Foskett, Ben well known to many people in ACBC, who really helped us to get this idea off the ground, and with very strong support from the Burnet's board. We were able to get an initial investment of 12.5 million RMB from Guomin Xinhe Group in Beijing, and I'll return to that a bit later. And the Burnet has largely been funding activities since late 2016. And the aim of the company was really to do that development, but especially the commercialisation of point-of-care diagnostic tests for both the Chinese and global markets, with that focus on unmet medical needs, which is the interest of Burnet, starting with an ALT1 test, which detects liver disease. And later we came up with the idea of this plasma separator that I'll describe in a little while. So we got off the ground and we were able to recruit staff, etc., and get going. And we were able to get space within what at that time was a Greenfields biotech park, a very nice park on the outskirts of Jiangsu, on the outskirts of Nanjing, I should say, but right across the road from the new Nanjing University campus, so a very good location. And we were able to fit out a GMP facility at very low cost. That is something that really must be emphasised in China, is how economical it is to get good space. And I'll now turn to the title of my talk, The Good, the Bad, and some insights. And the good, there were some really fantastic outcomes from our establishment of BioPoint over the years. The first was that it did allow us to develop the innovative liver disease ALT1 test, which at the time we started BioPoint was only an idea in our heads. And that test is now going forward and is fully manufactured, and we hope will do very well for us, for both the Burnet and BioPoint going forward. But the one that I think is a better example of what this allowed us to do is the plasma separator device shown on the left here. This was a PhD project for one of my students, Burhan Hale, from 2015 to 2018. But because we could see the immediate clinical need for this, initially for helping measure HIV viral load in patients, we were able to fast track the development in collaboration with Axon Limited in Melbourne, and then transfer this to BioPoint for full manufacturing. That allowed us to get ISO certification, a clinical trial that started in 2018, completed in 2018, I should say. Those results published in 2019, and the test achieving CE mark in 2020. And I compared that to our hepatitis E and our CD4 tests and think none of this would possibly have happened if it weren't for the support, weren't for the infrastructure that we'd established through Nanjing BioPoint. And I'll also emphasise right now how much else we have gained by having that presence in Nanjing and the relationships it has brought to us, one of which has resulted in two separate projects with Burnet Biotech in Jurong, another major city in Jiangsu, which has really helped us, supported by the Vic Jiangsu R&D Fund, which has really helped us to advance some dimeric IgA technology, which I won't talk about today, but which has been very important in the Burnet's diagnostics work in response to COVID and other infectious diseases. In the interest of time, I won't go through this. This is really just to show, this is what my PhD student did, was something on the bench that showed that something could work, but we were very quickly able to turn that into a fully manufactured device that passed all the manufacturing and stability, etc., that could actually then be used in those clinical trials. And being able to do that was just a godsend, because who knows whether we would have ever been able to achieve that if we were out talking to licensees with the very limited resources we had at that time. And on the strength of that, and with those good clinical results, we've had further support for the product development in different applications from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Australian Centre for HIV and Viral Hepatitis, and we see quite a bright future for this product. And as I mentioned, Jiangsu has been fantastic for collaborations. And I mentioned also the long-standing sister-state relationship. One of the very early things that happened in that sister-state relationship was visiting scientists and doctors coming out from Nanjing to what was then Fairfield Hospital, where I worked as part of the Burnet, or the virology department at that time. And we now have the opportunity to work again with many of those people, Professor Pan and Dr. Li Jun here in particular, and Fan Li standing to my left, who has been with the Burnet for the best part of 30 years since first coming out as a visiting scientist as well. So just highlighting how long our engagement there has been, and working with these partners in particular on that liver disease test. And that test has been well recognised in China, but it is taking us a long time to get through to clinical trials, I must say. The other test where collaborations in Nanjing have been extraordinarily important is the syphilis confirmatory test developed at the Burnet, but very much validated through studies in collaboration with the National Centre for STDs. Again, highlighting how much we can gain by those academic collaborations in China. And again, a published clinical trial last year. But I was asked also to talk about some of the bad things. And unfortunately, I would have to say that we didn't do a particularly good job of selecting an investment partner, because they were investors who had a very genuine interest in getting a footprint in Nanjing and seemed to have a genuine interest in biotech. But it is clear in retrospect that they didn't understand biotech. They had made most of their money in property development, and there was just a communication problem in terms of technical setbacks, which all of us know happen in biotech, particularly early stage R&D, as we were doing. And as a result, those partners failed to come through with the contracted second stage investment, which left us a bit high and dry and really not able. It gave us two problems. One was that we didn't have the financing to do the next stage of development as we'd wanted to. But the more acute problem really was that we had hoped, and the intention was, that they would have brought us the sort of business acumen and business connections in China to complement our medical and technical collaborations in China. And as a result of that, we really haven't had the market impact that we had hoped. We have fantastic products, but they have not given us the market outcomes that we wanted. A further issue that caught us a bit unawares was changes to the regulatory framework in China, which meant that our GMP facility, which is perfectly qualified for the rest of the world, no longer meets the air handling requirements for Chinese IVD manufacture. And so we haven't been able to do regulatory clinical trials in China with products that we make ourselves. So that has been a bit of a setback as well. But some insights that all of the good and the bad have given us is how important it is to have alignment of, excuse me, alignment of our expectations with investors and partners, especially regarding risks and timelines. And Anthony, speaking earlier about Cochlear, talked about how well aligned they have been with their partners in China. Unfortunately, I can't honestly say that we had the same strength of alignment, and that has been something that we really would advise people to be very careful of, to have great alignment with partners. We have fantastic relationships, skipping to the last point there, fantastic intergovernmental relationships and the fantastic support from the Victorian government. Brett Stearns, Sandy Guo, Sandy Gu, I should say, I would really emphasise in the Victorian office in Jiangsu. Fantastic support, but our commercial partners have not been as productive, let's say. We also, at the outset, I think, had an over-reliance on addressing the domestic China market, and without a full appreciation or the resources to tackle that properly. And combined with the unexpected regulatory changes, that left us in a bit of trouble in terms of being able to address that. We have been, in most cases, extremely pleased with the supply chain for things in China. And there are a number of things, raw materials for diagnostics manufacturing, that we struggled to get in Australia, even before COVID and shipping problems, because the manufacturers are in the US or Europe, and our needs are too small for them to want to address. But in China, really the IVD market in China is pretty much entirely self-sufficient now. And so any raw material you want, you can get, including many of the biologicals that we require. GenScript, I'll mention one company, happens to be in Nanjing. It's a US company, but their operations are in Nanjing. And we've worked very closely with them for many of our requirements. But it is worth saying in the context of biotechnology and particularly the sort of infectious diseases work we do, the inability to share human biological samples between countries is a real problem. It's very, very difficult for us to get plasma samples, for example, from one country to another. And shipping of all biologicals has been somewhat problematic. And we really hadn't appreciated how difficult that would be. It has also got more difficult over time with regulatory constraints. And I have already mentioned how good the government support has been. Now, on balance, I feel that, one thing I forgot to mention is how useful Nanjing Biopoint has been for both Biopoint and Burnet in getting other grant support for other projects, many of them done at the Burnet. But we have, particularly with the impact of COVID and the inability to readily travel backwards and forwards from China, plus the impetus from the COVID pandemic and local interest in diagnostics manufacturing, we have decided that we really need to build capacity onshore as well. And with that in mind, at the beginning of this year, the Burnet established what's known as the Burnet Diagnostics Initiative. 10 years ago, when we set up Biopoint, no one was interested in early stage diagnostics in Australia, especially not for infectious diseases. It was seen as just not investable at all. And that's part of the reason we went to China. But of course, with COVID and nationalism, let's say, or sovereign capability, I think is the politically correct way to put it. Now there's a lot of interest in domestic capacity, and we believe that that's something that we can help to address here as well as our activities in China. And as a result, we have appointed Jen Barnes as the director and really commercial driver of the Burnet Diagnostics Initiative, technical and quality management from Heidi Drummer and Thomas McKesker, who I seem to have left off the slide, I'm sorry, and really building a much better quality framework into the Burnet's local diagnostics R&D, so that we can achieve many of those aims we have for China domestically as well. And of course, one of the drivers of that last year was strong support from the Victorian government for us to do COVID-19 diagnostic and immunity test development in Victoria, which I don't have time to go into today. So I'll just close by thanking a lot of key people. I have left off people who were involved at the very start of BioPoint, but my colleagues in the lab in Burnet when we set up BioPoint, and Feng Yi, our Managing Director of BioPoint, seen there, Mary Garcia and Hoi Van, our team at BioPoint in Nanjing. And one other insight I would give you is how much of a family your Chinese workforce will become. A fantastic group of people to work with and feel very committed to them. And a point that I always like to make is how important it is to have good trusted advisors, and Annie Ju, our legal advisor in Shanghai, has given us that all the way along. And I'll close there. Thanks, Virginia. Just highlighting how much I have loved all the time in Nanjing and how much I miss it and look forward to getting back there soon.
Sentiment, we all agree with you on that, David. Thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation, and very interestingly how much you reflect the comments from Anthony and the Cochlear experience.